Welcome to Monrovia Canyon Park. You'll notice that there is a wonderful variety of plant life to be studied, to be enjoyed here in the park. And there are a relative handful of plant communities to experience up close and personally here. We have the Southern California oak woodland, primarily responsible for the largest trees in the park, which include, of course, the oaks. You will also see the large size white alder trees, sycamores, and you will see our bay trees. All of these trees border and present themselves inside of this Southern California oak woodland. Another actually is closer to the water. As you approach the wash, you will experience plant life that is accustomed to a more moist setting. That plant community is called the riparian community. A lot of these plants need to be directly in touch with a freshwater source or very near. Mule fat is like that. We have also some invasive species that are riparian that you can experience along the shores and inside of the water. Up among the drier hillsides, especially in a more sloped or angled position, there are two more plant communities, namely the coastal sage scrub and the chaparral. The coastal sage scrub is called the soft chaparral. A lot of the plants are densely covered with hairy surfaces on their leaves to resist the drought and the heat. Our sages, our salvias are in that class. That's the coastal sage scrub. Farther up and even drier still is our chaparral. Here you will find shrubs providing architecture and habitat for a lot of foraging animals. The chaparral is regularly accustomed to being burned. They're adapted also to then burning through a fire. Many of their seeds of these plants and shrubs in the chaparral remain dormant until they experience a fire, so that post-fire, when the coverage is then eliminated, they are allowed to germinate with the post-fire rains. So that is the chaparral the community. So the chaparral, coastal sagebrush, coastal sage scrub, riparian, and Southern California oak woodland are our primary plant communities here in the park. So you are about to experience a walk along the Bill Cull Trail. Open your eyes, keep your ears open, experience the sights, sounds, and feelings that we so enjoy and so love here at Monrovia Canyon Park. So here we are at the base of our California western sycamore, our native sycamore. The western sycamore is Platanus racemosa. And there are a couple of them here, small grove, growing just north of the ranger station here at the entrance to the park. California western sycamore like to have some tap roots in high groundwater. Sometimes that means it's the wash. Other times down in the valley, it is actually a higher occurrence of the water table. Because we're in the first week of the new year, the leaves are just now becoming deciduous and going to be dropping for the final couple months of the winter, getting ready for their new leafage, new budding, and then fruiting. And you can see by the mottled bark, it's the telltale sycamore tree distinguishing factors here, the mottled bark that flakes off wonderfully. So here's our California sycamore. So right underneath our sycamore here we have lemonade berry, and she's wonderfully flowering at this time of year. She's got great little flowers, and she will have a tart, kind of a squashed disc shape, almost the size of an aspirin. That is the lemonade berry. It'll be covered by fine red hairs, and you can pop that in your mouth when it's ready and taste the tart lemon flavor. You can also put it in water, give it a shake, and you'll have instant lemonade. Very close to a couple of our other ones, sugar bush and the laurel sumac, looking very similar, all three. And you might even throw toyon in there as well to make four that look semi-similar. And they're chaparral plants, so they grow in similar circumstances as well. This is lemonade berry. Silvery bark and tiny, tiny little dentation on the leaves, little tiny spines on the leaves there. And green underside leaf color there too. This is coast live oak, and you can tell by the acorns up here too, they're thin and long. That's Quercus agrifolia. This is our ubiquitous coast live oak. Coast live oak trees like a quick draining situation, usually on our slopes. Although some of them will be closer to water, I think they prefer not to be right next to the water, and they like a little bit of the sun too. And they'll definitely take a lot more sun than some of the other oaks like canyon oak. Do you know what an oak gall is? There's one right up here, and oftentimes people think, what is that thing hanging? And they think it's part of the tree fruiting. Do you see this little ball? It looks like a ping pong ball. That's an oak gall, and it's actually a formation made by the reproductive cycle of a wasp. And the wasp lays its eggs, I believe, in the branch, and then it swells the cells of the branch up to accommodate the premature growth of the wasp. It's called an oak gall, and you'll see them all through our trees. It's not part of the tree, it's actually the insect in this kind of symbiotic relationship. So the tall plant that looks very lush with the palmate leaves, in other words, they look like the palm of a hand, that is castor bean, Ricinus communalis. It's also the taller one behind with the reddish branches. It just is a different form there. They will grow to be small trees. They're perennials. They're castor bean. That's one of our non-natives. It's one of our invasives. It's an exotic. We like to get rid of that. And as you can see, there's clusters of the seeds at top right now. So it's also a toxic plant. Those folks dealing with removing it and must be careful too to safeguard it from getting too much skin contact. So that's Ricinus communalis. And to our left here, the very tall, lanky looking plant, that's our non-native tobacco. We call it tree tobacco. It is a Nicotiana species. Supposedly it's from South America, Latin America, but is now made its way north and is now considered an invasive. And the seeds are tiny and will get everywhere below those tree tobacco. It's a pretty resilient plant as well. Long, tubular yellow flowers, gray-green, kind of matte leaves and branches. This medium-sized tree, although it's probably uncomfortably far from the actual wash, seems to be doing just fine. Perhaps it will never get its full height, intended height, at least. This is Ulmus rhombifolia, our white alder, and at this time of the year, our first week again coming up in January here, she's actually in flower. I should say the two parts are on here. This is the female part right here looking like a tiny cone, and these are the catkins, the male parts here that will shed the pollen. So it's a good time of year right now for this too. Ulmus rhombifolia. We see our alders all through the wash area, all through the canyon, with their feet directly in the water normally. On the Bill Cole Trail, this is the canyon gooseberry again up close. And again, you can tell a gooseberry because there are spines on it, as opposed to the currant, which is spineless, both being ribes. The super fruiting, lots of fruit, high in vitamin C and all the nutrients that the bears need. Thus we have a healthy bear population. So the flowers have just finished. Probably a lot of them have been pollinated, germinating. Seeds there will happen. So that should be happening, the seeds being the fruit, pretty soon. Mara macrocarpa. It is the wild cucumber. And it's kind of a fun display right now at this time of the year, again midwinter, that she's just coming alive, sending out these very, very potent, long, exploring branches with tendrils on them. If you see they come from a source, the source actually is a huge buried, I think it's a corm. It's a huge bulbous bulb underneath the ground there. And they can be quite large too. The leaf is palmate and will get larger and larger as the season works on until it can take no more and it becomes summer deciduous. It'll desiccate with the hot ambient air and the explosion of sunshine later in the year, having already done its flowering and its fruiting. And you can see the flowers are just coming out now. They're little tiny white star-shaped flowers when they're open. Pretty display of wild cucumber flowers now. And as you can see, most of this action on the plant's part happens before the leaves are fully developed and matured. It is true for a couple of our winter active native plants. They have to do all of their flower setting and fruit setting all before it becomes too hot. Though it's called wild cucumber, you don't want to be eating it. It actually has toxic qualities. So this is a sacred plant to the indigenous peoples here. One of the more special ones because of the diverse uses. It is Salvia apiana, white sage. So Salvia apiana, white sage, used by the indigenous people as smudge, cleaning spaces. Also, curiously, and I think most interestingly, it was rubbed over the body to obscure the human odor when people were hunting or tracking game, because the oils are incredibly aromatic. So it's a salvia, a sage. In an ideal setting, it'll grow to 6 foot tall and send these huge stalks of flowers out springtime, with actually white petaled flowers that are pretty large for a sage. In this case, you can see the old flower stalks with the seed capsules very small and tight. And as you can see, they're very, very tall. They're done. The plant becomes summer dry, summer deciduous, and basically dies back to its base. So you can see how large they get just in one cycle. This small, delicate-looking leafed plant right above it here is Lotus scoparius, our common deer weed. It is a good native habitat plant, butterfly, bees. In the summertime, it will also lose all of these tiny little fleshy leaves and thus look like this naked, green-branched plant right next to it, which is also Lotus scoparius, just minus its new leaves. The new leaves again coming out right now in this season, taking advantage of the low-angled sunlight and the cool temperatures, long nights. This is actually the circumstance in which all of our wildflower seeds are starting to germinate. So we're still here just above the ranger station on the Bill Cull Trail, and we are standing below a roost or laurel sumac. Again, ubiquitous all over the canyon. Has kind of a dusty red branches, small branches, reddish, silverish, grayish, smooth bark. It's a medium-sized tree or large shrub. And at this time of the year, it's still clinging to its last year's seeds. It also has very small white flowers that are similar to the lemonade berry, just a little smaller and tighter. Very distinct odor to the crushed leaves as well. Many of our native plants have distinct odors. If you're a hiker like me, I like to be crushing the leaves and investigate what smells are attached to those certain plants. And sometimes you can actually ID a plant by its smell. We haven't even gotten very far up the Bill Col, and we can turn around and see a variety of all diverse native flora, especially trees behind us. So right here northwest behind the ranger station, we're actually looking down on them is a grove of willow trees. And willows are a little tricky. You have to see the catkin and the leaves and some of the older bark to actually nail the ID. And we have about 5 native willows to California. It could be an arroyo willow. There's a Goodings willow, and those are probably 2 of the potential candidates for those willows. Again, willows growing in a riparian circumstance, there must be enough leaking water right under us and along at the base of this hillside for the willow to be happy. This one down below us, this is Artemisia californica. It's a very common sage scrub plant. You also see it in some reaches of the chaparral, but it's a coastal sage scrub plant all over northeast Los Angeles, all the way out here to our foothills. Artemisia californica, it's called California sagebrush, but it's not a sage. So you have to be careful with your common names. Sometimes they're misleading. This one is Lupinus hirsutissimus. It's stinging lupin. And this little guy will get to 3.5 foot tall and have very large pink flowers, which is one of the only pink flowering lupin. And here we are right on the Bill Col, and there it is, popped up on its own. We have a couple around the wilderness preserve as well. And you can tell it's the stinging lupin because it's got all of this kind of soft, almost thistly kind of down on it. And when it's large, you don't want to touch the branches at all, as the hairs on the branches are very irritating and will release and then get stuck in your skin or your clothing. But it's a very, very showy wildflower, and it's just started out here in a good situation. It could be quite large and quite dramatic. Stinging lupin. This plant in front of us here with the golden yellow stalk that looks about 3.5, 4 foot tall. This is our delphinium. This is our wild larkspur. It's actually got last year's seed heads on the top. Is curious because we're looking at last year's entire life production, and now in this season, now we're seeing the beginning growth of the winter growth for its new cycle, in which it'll pop up another stalk and flower away. It could be scarlet larkspur. We actually have a blue form that's not even 2 very unrelated colors, and yet they're both larkspur. This oak tree here is potentially a canyon oak, although this acorn looks a little small. They can get large. The leaves are definitely different, as are the acorns from our coast live oak. I just have to put it out there that oaks hybridize and cross in the wild in their natural circumstances. So even if somebody says, oh, that's such and such an oak, they should really inspect the tree closely, including the bark, acorns if possible, and the leaf shape and structure. The coast live oak has more spines on the edge. Although, that said, if you look at this one branch, you can see smooth leaf margins, and also, curiously, there's dentation with tiny spines on it. So here's the very one branch, just the first one we grabbed, with 2 different distinct leaves on it. So that's how ambiguous this can get. The coast live oak is a little bit more papery and can be a little curled and definitely have more of spines on the margins. So this is definitely not a coast live oak. This is probably a canyon oak. We have leather oaks up here as well, and once in a while we see Engelmans too, which is one of our rarer species of oaks. And we're very proud that we do have Engelmann in our wilderness preserve. You know, what's curious about the oak trees too, when they're younger, they'll have furrowed bark, and then as they get older, it's more like opposite other trees, right? Where they'll start out nice and sheen, smooth, and then they get furrowed. It's the opposite effect happens in the oak tree. So this canyon oak, Quercus chrysolepis, is distinct in a couple ways. First of all, the very, very large acorn. The profile of the tree is curious, and its architecture to me is reminiscent of a giant broccoli. In other words, there's a big long stem, thick trunk, and then there's foliage at the very top in kind of like the florets of a broccoli. As opposed to the coast live oak, which is busier and denser with foliage toward the ground. So this canyon live oak is looking at typically canyon live oak style, is naked all the way up to the top along the trunk. Well, I could speculate that this oak right here is an Engelmann. It's either Engelmann or blue. It's got more of a spade-shaped leaf. The margins are not toothed, nor are they predominantly spiny, a little smoother. It has a blue cast kind of a color. And the architecture of the tree, the branches are a little more open with spaces between them. That's also telltale for Engelmann and the blue oak. They're called mesic oaks. They'll take more sun, but they have to have their roots penetrate to a water source at a certain depth, or they won't be happy. Curiously, the Engelmann oaks are a leftover from warmer times, and we're at the very northern extent of their range. There's little scrub oaks that stay a small kind of stature too, and I know there's a couple of them that we have, the scrub oaks too. Curiously, the trees are a smaller stature, but their acorns are pretty big and juicy for the smaller trees. This one is black sage, Salvia mellifera. This is a common sage brush, coastal sage scrub plant community member. We have them all over our hills here in a nice sunny circumstance. Poor soil, good drainage. It's very aromatic. I personally find that each of the sages has a distinct smell. Again, if you get used to taking up the aroma of each plant that you investigate, you'll learn to be clued in on the smells as well for plant IDs. The whorls of the seed capsules are smaller on this one than they are on some of the other sages, and yet not as small as they are on the white sage. So this is black sage, Salvia mellifera. This wonderful tree is Betuloides cercocarpus, our mountain mahogany. And at this time of the year, the catkins, actually these are the seeds, they're called achenes, A-C-H-E-N-E. That's this style of seed formation, achenes. And they'll just be knocked loose, and they have a kind of a tassel on them to make them a semi-windborne. But with a backlighting, the entire tree will look silvery. Really, really beautiful and nice display on our hillsides when there are a bunch of them together. Whitish bark there. The leaves look similar to a ceanothus. They could be confused with the ceanothus or any of the rhamnus as well, a little smaller. Telltale silver bark though, and especially in this time of year, you can't miss these achenes, the seeds actually adorning the tree like little silver ornaments all over it. We are just up the Bill Call from the switchback part at the bottom from the ranger station up, and we're actually just entered into this area that used to be restricted because it had burned not long ago. And curiously, following fire are often a particular set of plants. This one in this area here is a ceanothus, and we don't see these everywhere, but they are available in the wilderness preserve. I'm not sure exactly which ceanothus this is. A better mark when we're looking at the flowers in a month or so. But you do see that the bark and branches are greenish, which I suspect they photosynthesize as well. And this can be summer deciduous as well, losing the rest of its leaves in the summer when the ambient temperature is too hot. But this is our ceanothus. And later on, in a month from now, this will be bedecked by flowers from white to dark blue. And sometimes there are variations in the colors inside of the same species. This plant right here is a solanum, which means it's related to the class of plants that we love to eat from, including tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers. And this is one of the white-flowered nightshade. White-flowered nightshade. It'll have small tomato-like fruits, very small though, maybe a centimeter in diameter when they're ready. But if you're a gardener and you've stared at the flowers of your eggplants and tomatoes, you'll look that they're very similar construction on this solanum. We have white nightshades, white flowering nightshades, purple flowering nightshades. There are black fruited nightshades, and I do believe, although deadly nightshade is a cousin, the berries are edible. The fern that you see here is the first one that we've talked about. This is the California polypody. And I think of poly meaning many, and pody potentially meaning leaves or formation. They've got the leaves look almost connected to each other and to the center branch, and that's kind of telltale. It's a very succulent, fleshy-looking fern. They're all coming to life right now, having been summer dormant because of the cool temperature, angle of light, and potential moisture. Curiously, ferns are spread by spores. They're more primitive than our flowering plants, so their spores are microscopic and usually airborne, so they will inhabit a whole slope. Here's another of our fern, and it looks just fine. It looks like it's been doing fine for months. This is the coffee fern, California coffee fern. You can see it's arranged like a fern, however, in mass like this, it doesn't look very fern-like. California coffee fern. Okay, here is a very locally beloved plant. This is the common name is toyon. It's Heteromelis arbustifolia. It is a chaparral plant. It's all over our local hills, from here all the way to the Santa Monica Mountains. Famously, it lent its name to Hollywood when unsuspecting people described it as a holly, and it's not holly, but it gave its name to Hollywood. And at this time of the year, post-Christmas, New Year's, it's bedecked in its beautiful red berries. Great bird food. I've seen mockingbirds all over it. All of our jays love it. All of the larger class of birds. Cedar waxwings. Small white flowers, not very fragrant. In fact, a little bitter when they're in bloom, but just gorgeous red berries. And it's a very controllable landscape tree. It'll reach just a medium height, not get too large, and it's pretty fast growing, so it's nice for a screen. It can also take pruning. Toyon. You know, across this view, we can distinguish which trees we're looking at by the subtle differences in color. The sycamore being the most distinguishing, with the white mottled bark and branches showing through, and now they're losing their leaves, so the leaves are turning a crisp brown, yellow to brown. They'll soon be falling. Also, there's a yellowish green cast to some of the trees that are more cylindrical and towering. That's the alder and all of its catkins full of pollen that we were looking at earlier. They actually follow the course of the canyon. In a satellite picture of our canyon, you can see this very distinct strip of alders following the water course, unmistakable even from a satellite image. The darker, lusher green are all of our oaks, mainly coast live oak, and they stay that evergreen, nice, deep, rich green the entire year. We're missing the maples right now because they've already shed all of their leaves, and their wonderful colors already maybe a month gone. Ageratina adenophora, Euptori locally. It's also called snake root. It's not a very well liked plant locally, as it's quite the invasive in the canyon bottoms. It is actually native to Mexico and supposedly was planted as an ornamental plant that eventually escaped and has naturalized and become invasive in proportion. It's got a white daisy-like flower. It produces huge numbers of viable seeds too, which just make it all the more of a headache as far as the invasive situation. Ageratina adenophora, Euptori. That fern is our western sword fern, Polystichum munitum. Again, in a northeast exposure, pretty much under guaranteed shade. In fact, just above it there's a bay tree providing even more of that guaranteed shade. Cool circumstances, never any direct sun. It's happiest this time of the year and for the next couple months until it starts warming and warming. So now is wildflower generating time, and definitely the ferns become active, unfurling their newest fronds. They reproduce by spores, as do all of our native ferns. And interestingly, their spores are used to remedy stinging nettle irritations. This sword fern is found in our oak woodlands and riparian zones. We have our native western blackberry, and we have our Himalayan blackberry, which is considered an invasive. One has 3 leaves, and I think that's our good one right there. The other has 5. I think the Himalayan has 5 together, and that's an invasive species. They both fruit, and they would both supply our bears with nutrition. However, of course, we prefer to see our native blackberry, but that's it there. The Western Pacific blackberry, Rubus or Sinus. Mugwort. This is Artemisia douglasiana. It's quite a common shrubby-like plant. It's a native perennial. It spawns from rhizomes. It has semi-hairy, woolly leaves, although that's quite variable given an exposure in a site. The leaves are lobed, coarsely lobed, maybe with 3 to 5 lobes. The leaves themselves can be green-blue, or they can be gray-green. Curiously, the leaves can be eaten raw or cooked. They're aromatic and a bit bitter. Mule fat, Baccharis salicifolia. Right there in the name, it's a baccharis that actually resembles a willow. Salicifolia means willow-like leaves. The common name, another common name beside mule fat, is seep willow. It's a relative of the coyote bush, and there are many members of the baccharis family. One encounters mule fat along the stream banks and any flood-prone areas of scrub. The seeds are born on tiny tufted plumes. The flowering and seeding happens throughout the winter. The entire plant, which may grow to a height of about 10 feet, may go summer dormant because of its summer deciduous nature. The leaves exhibit a fresh, turpentine-like scent. Sambucus nigra, or Sambucus mexicana. This is our elderberry. It's quite a popular species, quite common. It grows incredibly quickly and given a great site can get quite large. Keeping in mind that all parts of this plant are toxic, the fruits, when they are cooked, can be quite delicious. You can make them into jellies and jams and pies. As the parts of the plant are toxic, they're also very smelly, like acrid smelling. The stems of the vertical branches and trunks have a very soft, pithy center, and apparently they were used to make flutes by our First Nations peoples here. Elderberry can grow very quickly. It self-seeds rapidly and is dispersed by birds quite readily. It's apparent and evident all along our valley watersheds, all the way through the canyon, and again through some open forest situations. Okay, we're looking at sugarbush for sure here. The kind of upturned leaves like the taco, right? And then definitely the pointy on the end. You can even see the actual margin of this guy is pink-ish, right on the leaf margin there. Shiny. Sclerophilus means waxy coated leaves too. That's an adaptation to extreme heat and sun. Also, the taco shape prevents the entire leaf from being sun coated. It'll supply its own shade, and that's an adaptation for a chaparral extreme of hot temperatures and blazing sunshine, which is what we're getting right here. Although this is sitting on an east slope, its head is above the shade for sure. All the leaves are, so I would imagine pretty much 8 hours of sunshine this endures. And it looks lush. You can see all of last year's flowers, and this year's flowers are just starting now too. They'll open white and be similar to the lemonade berry as well. So that's sugarbush. This is a very special plant. This is our Whipplei, our Lord's candle. It's Yucca Whipplei. Our Lord's candle. It was a historic food source for the indigenous people. They treated the new growth stalk as like a giant asparagus. So they would cut it and boil the interior, and supposedly it was a succulent, wonderful, delicious food source. It is been chopped in this way next to us on the hiking trail because the ends of these leaf stalks are incredibly sharp. They'll penetrate your skin, and they happen to be right at kneecap level. So if you're not careful as a hiker or you're off trail, you might find that these can enter your skin, especially at kneecap level, which I have lots of experience with. Not fun. Yucca Whipplei, our Lord's candle, with a huge towering flower stalk later in the spring. The Yucca Whipplei, once they flower, that's the end of the life of that plant. So it must be, I think, some people have calculated maybe about 15 years it takes to get full size. And then once it's ready to flower and sends up that stalk, the plant is then spent and will rely on seeds or baby. They're a kind of like yucca-lets that form at the stalk sometimes. Important food source. These beautiful trees right here are just gorgeous, and probably some of the largest in the park, actually, that I've seen. And this is our big-tooth maple, Acer macrophyllum. It's the largest leafed maple, I think, in the continental United States. Big-tooth maple. Right now, it's leafless. It is winter deciduous. So it's doing its right thing. You can see a couple leftover leaves, but primarily they're all below us. They get very, very large, looking like a hand, so it's called palmate. It's got a little more softer edge to it as opposed to the sycamore. I can actually feel a little bit of velvet behind here too. I don't know where the tree is. This is definitely the big-tooth maple. And they call it big tooth because of these big pieces to it. They usually turn a nice intense yellow before they drop, so they're very beautiful. And we don't have, in southwestern North America here, we don't have many trees that display a fall color, and our big-tooth maple is one of them that does, being a nice, clean, golden, intense yellow. These trees are very large. And again, this big-tooth maple only likes a riparian or canyon circumstance. Very important. That's why we don't see a lot of these maple trees in our area. Curiously, some of the newer branches will take on a blue-green quality before they take on the silver sheen of the bark. They'll be blue-green, and they look really, really beautiful, especially in the springtime. Just the newest of the branches. Curious color available on those guys. The newer trees, the younger trees, the bark will usually be silvery. Now you can see it's furrowed now because this is a quite mature specimen for sure. Eriogonum fasciculatum is our common California buckwheat. We see this all over the place, all over the sage scrub and in parts of our chaparral on slopes that are dry, especially and hot. This plant can be matted or it can be shrubbed and is highly variable depending on its exposure and moisture access. The leaves are like small pine needles. The stems are silvery and semi-hairy, and the young stems are actually edible. Anne Croissant from Santa Fe Dam Nature Center reports that this particular species is part of the last species assemblage to grow in the chaparral and sage scrub that's not been burnt. In other words, this is the kind of caboose on the train of plant assemblies that follow fires. It's an indicator that it's time for another fire, ecologically speaking. Eriogonum fasciculatum, our California buckwheat. A huge habitat plant attracting a variety of our native California bees and butterflies. Just take a look when it's in flower and you're bound for a nice insect show. Okay, here we see in flower because it's time of the year right now. This is our Umbellularia californica, which is our California bay laurel. It's actually, if you're familiar with some of your garden plants and fruit trees, the flowers are arranged similar to an avocado because they are actually in the same large family. It's a special tree for our canyon because it only grows in riparian circumstances or near to riparian so that its roots are close enough to a water source. They will rise above the shade, again, if they have moist circumstances. Otherwise, they will grow in the shade along the canyon bottom. Rather than grow vertically and towering and cylindrical like the alder does, this California bay tree grows laterally and has remarkable branches, and they're notched in a very peculiar, distinctive way, too. The bark turns almost black. It's almost like a sooty black. The leaves themselves are lance-shaped, they're shiny, and it's reminiscent of the emblem that Monrovia uses as their city emblem. It's intensely aromatic, acts as almost homeopathic medicine. If you crush the leaf and give it a good whiff, it'll rid yourself of a headache. Otherwise, a crushed leaf will keep canyon flies and gnats from around your shoulders and neck. Just be careful getting it on your skin, as it can be irritating to some people too. The indigenous people actually layered these leaves supposedly between layers of smoked and dried fish that they would catch, preventing the fish from being contaminated by maggots. Later on, when these blooms turn to the fruit, they'll look like miniature avocados, just a lot thinner flesh and one big pit in the middle. Umbellularia californica, our California bay tree. This is, curiously, this is an important plant to be on the lookout for. It is our poison oak. The problem with it at this time of the year is there are no identifying leaves on it. So you have to know what you're looking at. But because there are no leaves, consequently the problems are lessened. The oil that would cause the irritation to the skin is not as much available in the dry branches here as they are in contact with leaf. But it's hard to see, it's hard to identify, of course, without the leaves. There is one identifying factor, and those are those whitish, beigeish looking fruits that are dried up, actually attached to some of the branches. And that's typical poison oak fruits, which actually this is an extremely important habitat plant. A lot of birds eat those berries. So here we can see wonderfully how our white alders look right here in the canyon bottom. We're at the end of the Bill Cull Trail now, intersecting with the small trail up from the middle parking lot, as we'll work our way up to the nature center. But here in this bottom open portion, right stream side, you can see just like a parade, a quiet caravan here. Here are our Ulmus rhombifolia, the white alder, growing as vertical as they can, competing for the sunshine above this very shady, moist, cool canyon, which is where they like their roots in the water. A telltale sign to me of them are these eye-shaped residuals of the limbs. They look like eyes to me, and they're checkering the trunk all the way up. Ulmus rhombifolia, our white alder, very distinct trees, total riparian. Right here is our Dudleya lanceolata, the lance leaf Dudleya. It's in the Crassula family. It's one of our few native succulents. Very special little plant in that you don't see it everywhere. It has to be in loose, rocky slopes like you see here, with very little soil and these little tiny pockets between the rocks where they get a grip and do their thing. They have wonderful orange striped bell-shaped flowers at a certain time of the year. Kind of late summer, I believe. Dudleya lanceolata, special plant. We're right alongside the spur trail that links back and forth up and down from the nature center to the waterfalls trail. So here we are right on the eastern flank of this trail. We have this rocky formation, and here are the Dudleya. And there are literally hundreds in here. Once you start looking, you'll see more and more of them. Some of them very, very tiny. This is Encelia californica. It's called the coast sunflower in common names. There's two varieties of Encelia that we have actually in the preserve, growing naturally. This one, Encelia californica, and we have the Encelia farinosa, which is called the desert brittlebush, and that's growing over in above the burn area. And though they're cousins, upon first glance they look very different. This one's got the green, lush-looking leaves. The other one, the farinosa, is more gray and velvety because it's used to a more arid condition, actually. And though you can't see it right here, it actually is the same family, this huge family of the Asteraceae, which is the sunflower family. And they look like miniature sunflowers, and they're yellow. You can see how diverse the salvia species are, right? This one not even looking related to this per se. This is a Salvia spathacea, the hummingbird sage. And this one has a scent of almost pineapple or candy, the leaves do. And so do the flowers. This one is a great specimen for people who are at a loss as to what to plant under an oak tree, which is an important equation for us because oak trees cannot be watered underneath if you really want a long-term success on your oak. Right next to it here with the feathery leaves, you probably recognize this is a yarrow, the Achillea millefolium, the white flowering yarrow. It's a medicinal plant. It's also a great cover crop. It draws nutrition into its vicinity, so it actually will put nutrition into the soil. And this is actually a native. This is our yellow yarrow, the Achillea flora. It's flowering right now. So there's the yellow yarrow, again by seed too. We have some of this along ridgeside in the cooler north-facing areas. Although this one's pretty baked by the sun and it's doing all right. It'll also grow in shade. This one here is the penstemon spectabilis. This is our big showy penstemon is the common name. When it's ready, after it's got a good start, which this one's so far so good, this is actually by seed. When it's really taken hold, it'll shoot up a stalk that'll be 4.5, 5 foot tall, loaded with 2-inch long purple trumpet flowers. Actually, this was in historic competition for our state flower at one time, but it lost out to the poppy. But it was a good potential candidate. We have poppies, of course. Here's a little poppy right here, our California poppy. They're ubiquitous and easy to grow by seed. The interesting thing on poppies is they will act as an annual if their conditions are harsh, but they will also become a perennial if their conditions are ideal. And their stems develop the proportions of a carrot in the same color too. It's an intense orange and they can be really deep. This is California fuchsia, which is one of my personal favorites for a couple reasons. Although you can't see a flower right now, maybe we'll see a flower on it. It's an intense kind of reddish orange. They're trumpet shaped. They're a hummingbird favorite. It had an old name called Zauschnedia. It's been updated to an epilobium. They're called Epilobium canum. And there are a couple cultivars that people grow for more flowers per se, but the original is the Epilobium canum, which this is it. This grew by seed as well. What's fun is this blooms at a time when nothing else is blooming in our foothills, which is like late summer. So where the hummingbirds won't have any other flowers going on, this is a great food source for them, and they count on this. This we see all over our preserve, especially on bent over turf. It's like all over the slopes as you walk up there too. You can't miss it. And it'll do sun or shade. It'll take the drought and it'll also take extra water. And it's very easy to grow by seed. This is a spectacular plant. California fuchsia. Miner's lettuce. This is Claytonia. And it's either parviflora or perfoliata. This species, the Claytonia, miner's lettuce, is highly variable and there's a lot of genetic mixing. It's a tender early spring annual that is actually quite delicious. The flowers are very small and white and rise on this tiny little stem above the curiously shaped leaf that is disc shape fused to the stem. Interestingly though, that's not what the first leaves look like on miner's lettuce. The first leaves look like wide blades of grass. Then the second stage of leaves look like hearts. The third stage of leaves are the final leaves, which are these fused discs. The plant is all through the canyon. Miner's lettuce, Claytonia.